தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் TVI.
Welcome to CrossRoads on TVI, a show that showcases the Tamil Canadian community, their issues and their successes. I'm your host, Manjula Salvaraja. On our show today, we will speak to people who are telling survivor stories from Vanni, former UN worker Benjamin Dix and author Francis Harrison. But before we get started, let's take a look at this video.
In 2009, the civil war fought between the Sri Lankan army and the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam reached a climax. In one of the most brutal counterinsurgency operations ever mounted, at least 40,000 civilians were killed.
Hi, my name's Ben. I worked for the United Nations in the Vanni in Sri Lanka from 2004, just after the tsunami, until the UN evacuation in September 2008.
My name's Lindsay and I'm an illustrator working with Ben on The Vanni, which is a graphic novel about the civil war in Sri Lanka and the rippling after effects on a single Tamil family.
Benjamin Dix was working with the United Nations and the Norwegian People's Aid in Vanni from 2004 to 2008. As the fighting between the Sri Lankan Government and the LTTE escalated, he was part of the contingent that was ordered to leave the area by the Sri Lankan Government in September 2008. Lindsay is the filmmaker behind the HBO documentary The One That Got Away, about a Holocaust survivor, and Will Never Meet Childhood Again, about pediatric HIV in Romania. Lindsay Pollock was not available to join us today, but I do want to add that together they are creating a graphic novel titled The Vanni that tells the story of a Tamil family living through the horrors of that time, from bombing to the internment camps. Benjamin Dix, however, is joining us on Skype today from London. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure having you on, and we may as well start off by finding out what prompted you to start this initiative.
Well, I think when I left Vanni in 2008, I'd been there for nearly 4 years and had made such strong friends within the community around Kilinochchi and Mulativu, amongst my staff and outside the UN and NGO world. And the whole evacuation process and then the media blackout after we evacuated was something that really troubled me, that the Tamil community didn't seem to have this voice of these horrific events that occurred through 2009. And I really wanted to try and tell the story of survivors who are now asylum seekers across the world, but try and tell that story in a kind of creative and innovative way. And I thought, if there's an abundance of official reports of the UN, of Amnesty, there are fantastic books like Francis's book and films like the Sri Lanka Killing Fields. But I thought that if I created something that a wide range of age groups and communities around the world could actually engage with, that might be something new and fresh and innovative. So I thought actually a graphic novel that we can all connect with, drawings and illustrations and much smaller sound bites through these speech bubbles. And I thought that might be quite an effective way to try and tell stories of what actually happened in Vanni.
Now, your story was featured in Francis Harrison's book, Still Counting the Dead. You were featured as the aid worker in that story, which was your experience. Tell us a little bit about your time there right before you left in September 2008.
Well, it was, I got to Vanni 3 days after the tsunami at the end of 2004. And obviously arrived there in a very difficult time. And then for the next 3 years, I just really enjoyed living in Vanni. I thought it was an absolutely stunning place. I thought the community were incredibly welcoming, very generous, very kind of politically and globally minded. And then as the conflict started to escalate through the end of 2007 and into 2008, the situation became more desperate, and it was such a tragedy to see this very fragile community, but also this beautiful area being destroyed. And we started to work with the IDPs that were moving from the Mullativu and Mannar district on the borders near Volnya, and starting to work with some of those IDPs that had to displace so many times as the army was pushing up behind them, and that was really quite harrowing to see these communities that were being pushed out of their villages and having to leave in the middle of the night, and obviously the emergency situation started to increase. The last few days before we left were incredibly difficult, trying to work with our staff that weren't able to leave Vanni for any number of reasons, and then having to say goodbye to some of my friends there was was by far the most traumatic experience of my life. I'd worked for the UN, and I kind of thought that this was what I'd signed up to do, to work in an area and give protection, witness and assistance to communities in difficult situations, and suddenly having to evacuate when the situation reached a certain point was incredibly traumatic for myself and my colleagues.
What's interesting, because when I first heard of this graphic novel initiative that you and Lindsay are working on, it reminded me of this book that was written. It's an autobiographical graphic novel about the before and the after of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, titled Persepolis. You've probably heard of it. And I remember reading that and thinking, it sort of really gave me a view into things that I wasn't hearing through sort of other outlets. What are you hoping to achieve with this graphic novel?
Well, in a similar way, I mean, Persepolis was one of the... I don't have a background in comics. Lindsay, who unfortunately can't be with us today, he's been drawing comics for many years, and he's a bit of a geek and kind of goes back to the kind of comic times of growing up reading comics. But I'm new to this, and about 6-7 years ago, I read Persepolis, and I also read Joe Sacco's book on Palestine. And these are two conflicts that I didn't know much about in Iran and Palestine, not much more than your average kind of, broadsheet newspaper reader. And I found that because you're dealing with illustrations and small sound bites of speech bubbles rather than pages and pages of text, you could really kind of start to engage with the characters in the book. And you felt something for them as an outsider that had never been to Palestine, never been to Iran. And so with our book, The Bunny, I want to get this out much past the Tamil audience and out to a readership that don't know much about Sri Lanka, that still kind of view Sri Lanka as that place you might go for a honeymoon or your holiday and sit on the beach, but they don't really know about the conflict. And so I thought if we wrap the story up into a story about one Tamil family, and the reader gets to know this family, and the family consists of, I don't know if you can see, but they're on the wall here behind me, but you can see them on the website, of Anthony, Rajani, Priya, Appama, and the two children. And if you'll engage with this family and you'll get to know them, and you'll understand that actually they're the same as any other family around the world. They're just born into a time and place which was incredibly difficult to live through. They went through a horrific war, and now they're trying to find their place in the world as asylum seekers, as refugees. And so I'm hoping that the general reader will connect with this, and will be able to empathise and sympathise with this story and with this family.
So, I mean, let's get to the characters. Tell us a little bit about the characters and how you're actually going about telling the story.
So what I'm doing is I'm working with a group of Tamil asylum seekers who have come to. They're all anonymous and their names are fully confidential, and they're giving me their testimonies of the life that they lived through before, during, and after the conflict. So we start off in 2006, and I'm collecting the testimonies from their life in the Vanni. Then, as they had to displace from their home, so our family is based from Champianpatu in Vadamarachi East in Vanni, and then how they first displaced and they came down to Peranthan near Kilinochchi. Then after the UN evacuation, they moved down into the no-fire zones 1, 2 and 3 and lived through the horrors of the conflict. They then went and lived in Manic Farms and all the difficulties and horrors that occurred there. They then escaped to Chennai, and in Chennai, the remaining family members are in Chennai, while the husband leaves with agents and travels to London as an asylum seeker. And so through these testimonies, these are real stories that people in the Tamil community have lived through. And we set the protagonist, Anthony, who's the husband, in London in the present day of 2012. And he is an asylum seeker, and we deal with his issues of his identity, of being an asylum seeker in London, which I'm sure is very similar to being in Toronto or Paris or Zurich, wherever. And as we reflect back on the last 6 years of his life through conversations with his asylum lawyer and through Skype conversations with his wife in Chennai. And through those conversations with the lawyer and the wife, we kind of look back on how he got to London. And again, I want the reader to really understand that, you know, this guy Anthony is someone that you sit next to on the bus in London or in Toronto or in Paris. It's someone you might walk past on the street. And I don't know how the situation is there in Toronto, but you know, there are many issues surrounding asylum seekers here in the UK that the British public often look at them as a threat to, these are people that come over and they want to take our jobs or you know, for financial reasons. That's why they come to England. And I want them to really maybe try and challenge that view that Anthony actually doesn't want to be in England. He would quite like to be back on his beach in Sri Lanka in the Vanni as a fisherman. And being here isn't part of his life plan, but circumstances and global politics has meant that he's here. And these are the kind of things that I really want to challenge in the reader in the book. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say that actually it's interesting that you say that view of the asylum seeker. It's true that in itself needs some illumination. The idea that the person that's sitting next to you on the bus could have this bigger story behind them, right?
Exactly, and you know, I mean, this story, the Vanni is set as a story about Sri Lanka, but I actually wanted the reader to kind of think outside the box, and it's not just Sri Lanka. I'm using Sri Lanka because I have the Sri Lanka connection. I was working there for so long, and I have many you know, friends within the community, and I want to tell their story. Mm-hmm. But actually, the story of the asylum seeker could be a Somali. It could be a guy from Zimbabwe or Bangladesh or wherever, Afghanistan. This is a global problem, which Sri Lanka represents, you know?
Interesting. So, I mean, I know that you're just starting off on the project, or you've been working on it for 2 years, and I know that you're also looking for funds to get this finished. Perhaps you can speak about that.
Yeah, I mean, Lindsay and I have been working on this for about a year and a bit, about 14, 15 months now, and we've been building the project and conceptualizing it, how we're gonna tell these stories and doing the research behind it, and that we've completely funded ourselves. But you know, living here in London is it's expensive, and this is a full-time job. You know, all the drawings are hand drawn, and the amount of research and interviews that we have to do, it's very much a full-time project. So now we're trying to gather some funds together to be able to produce the project for the next 2 years, and deliver a chapter every 3 or 4 months online that people will be able to engage with. So we've started at the moment a Kickstarter fundraising initiative, which runs, I think, for the next 40 days, 40. It finishes in January 13th. And we're trying to gather funds through various communities and audiences to be able to fund us, to be able to work for the next year and a half on this project and produce something that, you know, really has great quality and has a place in the world for a large readership to engage with.
What's that website again, Benjamin? The Kickstarter one? Do you have the link with you?
If you go to we've produced a preview of the Vanni book, which you can go to www.thevanni.co.uk, and from there you can see on the front page kickstarter.com, and that's where you go to help fund the project.
Perfect. Well, we'll definitely add it to our Facebook page. And I know that if you go and Google, I believe the Vanni project, you can find it as well, because I was researching it before I got a chance to speak to you. So I know that our audience would be interested in hearing about that. So how do you, I mean, I'm trying to understand what it's like to gather these survivor stories. What are some of the challenges that you run into?
Well, they're, you know, like I'm sure Francis said, they're incredibly difficult and emotional testimonies to gather. And for me personally, as the author of this book, it's a very difficult thing for me to gather because, you know, I was part of the UN system that evacuated from Vanni, and therefore I also come with, you know, I have a sense of guilt and abandonment as we left Vanni in 2008, and I had to say goodbye to these friends. And so sitting in London, Zurich, Chennai now and researching this book it's really difficult to hear some of these stories. Then the challenge is to gather those testimonies and turn them into a narrative that, like I said, a wider readership will read. So I have to, you know, myself and Lindsay, we're not Tamil. I didn't live through the conflict. I didn't lose family members. I don't know what it's like to go through that experience. So one of the challenges is to lessen my voice. I will write the overarching narrative, but I want the Tamil respondents that I work with to actually fill in all the gaps. So it makes it, you know, culturally very specific, and all the nuances are just right. And they don't come from me. They come from people who actually lived through the conflict. And I think that's what hopefully will make it a really special book, that, you know, I'm in a position to write the book, but they're in a position to actually give me the material.
Now, when you, in your interaction with these survivors, I mean, are you finding that how do you establish that trust to get the story? Even though you are providing some anonymity, there must be that barrier that you have to get past.
Yeah, I mean, I guess now, because I gave my personal testimony on the Sri Lanka Killing Fields film, and also in Francis's book. I was on the BBC the other week when the UN report came out. So I guess, you know, within the Tamil community, there's a certain trust that people know who I am, and I've spoken out on behalf of the community. So there's a kind of trust that's already established there. And then I guess a lot of the people that I'm working with are people that I knew from when I was in the Vanni, so they know who I am, or they're friends of friends or whatever. So most of the people I'm working with, there's a kind of personal connection with already, which kind of overcomes a lot of the hurdles. But then you have to take these things incredibly slowly, be very patient, because these are, you know, some of the most horrific personal stories that people are going to ever tell you. And that's difficult for them telling me, and for me to absorb those stories is, you know, some tears are being shed through this project. It's a difficult one to work on.
So, you know, I always wondered, and I unfortunately didn't get a chance to ask Francis this question, so I'll ask you, do you get a sense from these survivors, and you may not have an answer to this, but do you get a sense from the survivors about the feelings that they have either about the international community, the UN, the Tamil diaspora, or the government, any of those? Do you get any of that, or do they simply focus on their own stories?
No, a lot of this stuff comes out that, you know, there's a lot of anger and confusion, especially at the international community, that, you know, the situation was able to get to such a horrific point. There was confusion at why the UN abandoned them and left in September 2008. I think within the Vanni there was often some divide between people living in the Vanni and the diaspora, who look at conflict from different perspectives, right? People are living through it and people are watching it from afar. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, some of this stuff does come out. But actually, I mean, what mostly comes out is a lot of trauma and a lot of, it's still very recent, you know. It's Lindsay, as you introduced him, you know, did a project on the Holocaust. Now that's 60 years ago, so people have time to absorb that trauma and time to go through it. And there's been so many narratives and films and books and documentaries written and produced on that. This is still very raw. It's 2009, so it's 3 years ago, and that sense of emotion is still there, and it's still there within me as well. It's this is a new thing, and maybe in years to come it gets easier to work on projects like this. But at the moment, it's pretty raw and difficult, as Francis would have found as well.
Do you find, I mean, it's been interesting because I see that in the last, I mean, I know that these people have been working on it for a while, but it just seems like even on this show, we've had a couple of people that are, I would say, non-Tamils that are telling stories. We've had, we were talking to you now, we have Francis Harrison, we also spoke to the director of Silenced Voices, Beatty. So do you think that there is some momentum here around telling stories, or do you think it's just a coincidence that all of these are sort of breaking at the same time?
Well, again, it takes time to produce these kind of things, and it is new. 2009 wasn't that long ago, and the people, the survivors of that conflict, are now kind of 2009, they're in the end of the war, Manic Farms. 2010, they're Manic Farms, maybe Chennai. 2011, they're coming into Europe, Canada, wherever. And 2012, we start working on these projects.
Yes.
So I think that's actually quite, it's quite clear that we're all starting to work on these. But I think between myself, Francis, Beatty, Callum, it's been it's a very different conflict, this one, because it was such a media blackout. And, to go back to your past question, a lot of the community that I'm working with and the individuals are very upset, as I was, that you see in the news every day things that are happening in Syria, in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. But no one talks about Sri Lanka. I had my hair cut the other day for this interview. And my barber my hairdresser was talking about he was going on his honeymoon to Sri Lanka, and has absolutely no idea about the war. He heard about something about Tamil tigers and whatever, but doesn't have any understanding how horrific it was. And so I think for the group of internationals that I'm working with, like Francis, BT, Callum, etc., we feel that there's a great unjust in this, and it was such a brutal conflict. So many lives were lost, and the media didn't really pick up on this. The international community failed in this conflict, and those stories need to be told. That history needs to be written down, whether it's a film, a book, a graphic novel. Otherwise, those 30 friends that I lost, and the people that I'm working with now, their stories deserve to be told. Otherwise, they're lost to history, and that doesn't sit well with me.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks very much, Vanni.
And we hope to see this go into production and have you back when it's a finished product.
I really look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. We will take a break now. On our next segment, you'll see our pre-recorded interview with Frances Harrison, author of Still Counting the Dead, Survivors of Sri Lanka's Hidden War. Stay with us. You're watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Savaraja. Welcome to a special interview with Frances Harrison on TVI. Ms. Harrison is the author of Still Counting the Dead, a harrowing account of the last months of the 2009 war in Sri Lanka between the Sri Lankan Government forces and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil that claimed between 40,000 to possibly over 140,000 lives. Now, in saying those numbers, we at Crossroads certainly do not want to sound trite. Why we're quoting both of those numbers is because a UN panel has pegged the number at 40,000, while the Bishop of Mannar has gone on record to say that there are 147,000 people that in the area that are unaccounted for, which probably explains the name of Miss Harrison's book. And now let's say a little bit about Frances Harrison. She has worked as a foreign correspondent for the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Iran, including 4 years in Sri Lanka, and also as the head of news at Amnesty International. A Cambridge graduate and formerly a visiting research fellow at Oxford, she joins us in the studio to talk about her book. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I made some assumptions about why the book was titled that, and definitely in reading your book, this is it here, Still Counting the Dead, I saw that phrase repeated a couple of times. Perhaps you can explain the title to us.
Yes, of course, it's about the fact that there is no death toll, that it could be, we can't even round up to the nearest tens of thousands of people, and that's an extraordinary shock, really, in this day and age, that you don't know how many people died in a conflict. And also, it was about making the dead count for something, because that was really what the motivation was of all the survivors who very bravely spoke to me. They wanted the people who never made it out to count for something, to matter, to mean something. And so they took this extraordinary step of talking to me about things that they'd really rather forget, and that it was very, very painful, because they wanted to make those people matter and count for something.
And I think that there was a testimonial that someone wrote about your book that said the same thing, that you're trying to make these people more than just numbers, actual, bring the humanity back to them. So again, what prompted you to write this book? You've been asked that a million times, I'm sure.
No, I mean, it's a really complicated story in a way. I mean, obviously I lived in Sri Lanka for 4 years, and I was there during the peace process time, and I visited the Vanni a lot, and I knew those people quite well. It's a small area. So I was unusual in terms of correspondence that I happened to be there at the right time to, check out the place and get to know the Tigers. And then I went on to another job. I went to Iran, and I then went back to London. And I kind of, it was a bit behind me. But then Sri Lankan journalists who I'd known in Colombo started becoming refugees in England, and I got to know them again. And throughout the war, the last phase of the war, I talked to one of the senior Tigers on Skype. And it kind of left its mark on me, and I waited after the war. I mean, obviously I watched Pulidevan being killed in the White Flag incident, surrendering. And, that was upsetting having talked to him. But I sort of thought it wasn't my problem and somebody else would deal with it. And I waited to see what the world would do about it. And, a year went by and really there was nothing. There was the UN Human Rights Council that congratulated Sri Lanka. And then I happened to meet an old friend who was an academic who'd just written a book about the liberation struggle in Bangladesh, kind of revisiting it on both sides. And the penny dropped, and I thought, okay, as just one person, one individual, with the skill set I have, the very least I can do is try and tell the story of what happened, this sort of black hole, this gap in history where nobody witnessed what happened from outside. And I decided that's what I would do. And the more I dug into research, I read everything that was out there, I watched everything I could find, the more shocked I was at the sort of extraordinary twists and turns. When I discovered that some of the senior military generals who'd been conducting the war were actually now diplomats abroad, I was sort of staggered, and I just went from there. And the journalists in exile, Tamil and Sinhalese that I knew, helped me find people, and I found the first person, and then they introduced me to somebody else, and then someone else. So I travelled throughout Europe, and I went to Australia, where even the stories were more shocking in Australia because of the boat journeys abroad. And I think the first woman I interviewed was the mother in my book, and my eyes popped out of my head when I heard some of the things she said, and I didn't think that I thought it would just be that 6 months of war. I hadn't really banked on what the story would be in Manic Farm refugee camp or internment camp. I didn't realise that the escape stories would be so dramatic, that people would be crawling under barbed wire with their children and hiding and, you know, bribing their way out of the country and then going through human smugglers and going all around the world and sort of dicing with being caught all the time. So I sort of got 2 stories for one, as it were, and gradually realised that. So, yeah.
So tell us about some of the people, like who were some of the people that you interviewed for the book?
Well, I interviewed a lot more than are in the book. Obviously, there are people who I didn't put in the book because I couldn't fit them all in. But I interviewed, you know, a teacher, a doctor, a fighter, which I didn't think I would get initially, but I did, and a person who was disabled in a wheelchair, which, you know, going through a war like that is pretty difficult. I actually interviewed a girl who was blind as well, who went through the war, but she was really very traumatized. It was quite difficult to get enough to write a whole story. I interviewed a whole range of different people who in a way were interesting because they told me how they were happy before the war really kicked in and what they lost. And all of them illustrated quite different things. Initially, I thought I would do a long chronology of, you know, this happened on this date and then this thing and so on. And then I realised that actually a lot of people couldn't remember the dates of each attack. And the things that stuck in their mind were not, you know, particular shell attack on a particular date. It was just that they were sitting with their best friend having a cup of tea and a shell landed and killed the person in front of them. And it was really the journey of an individual through war that actually told you why it was interesting and why you should care.
Now, when we were out in the lobby chatting about this, you shared the story about how there were certain common themes that you found when you met these people that had escaped from the war zone and are living abroad. Perhaps you can share that, because I found it very interesting to hear.
Well, I found, you know, these were really broken, smashed up people. I mean, many of them were suicidal, have been suicidal, very, very deeply troubled and traumatized. Some of them whispered their stories. Some of them cried when I, you know, even just asked them to tell me what happened to them. Some of them didn't cry, and you thought, why are they not crying? They're so stony-faced when they're discussing these really horrific things. So the reactions were very extreme. One woman in Dublin just shook the whole way through the interview. She's not in the book, but it was just dreadful. And she was so skeletal. She was like Edvard Munch's Scream picture, and she was with her family, and the family were all really plump, and, you know, you couldn't tell they were from the same family or the same kind of species, really. It was very shocking, and the curtain behind her shook too, and it was very distressing. And my translator was a young Tamil man who was really distressed, I think, too, watching her. But I think overall, when I look at those people, I found their houses were very bare and empty, and yes, they were recent refugees and they were living in state housing, most people, and, you know, for example, the mother, her house was completely bare. I mean, there was nothing much except a portrait of her dead husband and a candle burning underneath it, and there was no sort of attempt to make it homely and, you know, spotlessly clean and beautiful. It ran, but there was no personal touches.
Why do you think that is?
I started feeling this atmosphere of sort of, it was inert, it was dead. It was almost as if they were recreating the feelings in their head outside, or maybe it was a sense of sort of impermanence and not really living in the present, because many of them said, look, I'm really half living in Sri Lanka still, and are not wanting to put down roots to a sort of resentment about being displaced like that. But I think, you know, I started taking flowers and plants to these people when I went for interviews, because I needed to see some signs of life there. It was odd. And I started, you know, you develop strange habits in response to the things you see. I started wanting to wear kind of bright colours, things that were cheerful, you know, pink clothes, because again, you want to kind of be an antidote to that death and destruction that is around.
That's very, very hard to even hear. So tell us the story. I mean, there was one story when I read the book, there's one story that stuck out for me, the story of the doctor. I was hoping that you could share that with our audience.
He's an incredible man. I mean, he's a hero for me. He's really incredible. You know, you wouldn't imagine, he just looks like anybody. And he lives in a country in Europe where he doesn't tell anybody there who he is, what he did, and he's completely anonymous. And yet, you know, he's a guy who part of a team of doctors, nurses, medics, volunteers who saved 20,000 lives. And, you know, he gave his own blood to save a girl's life at one point. He thought he would die. He sent his family off in a ship after his wife was injured, and he stayed in these hospitals. And the last time he slept in a bed, you know, proper night's sleep, was, I think, December 2008. And he just would have naps sitting upright in the armchair. He trained his medics because, I mean, they had so many dying people to operate on, to do surgery on. They had to make life and death choices, who was going to live and who was going to die. And he trained his medics and his volunteers to prepare the patients for surgery, sort of clean the wounds or whatever, or open it up so that it was ready for him to do. He did a lot of bowel surgery. And then he trained another one to sew them up afterwards. So
and they were not doctors per se, just
well, I think they were sort of fairly trained, you know,
okay.
but to be able to do that. But he worked out this sort of conveyor belt system so that he'd be in the middle, they'd be preparing the patient for the surgery, and then this one would be stitching them up, and they would just go through so they could operate on more people. I mean, it was incredible.
And in dismal conditions, because in your book you say they didn't really have anesthetic.
They ran out of anesthetic, they ran out of antibiotics, the hospitals were being deliberately targeted. I mean, what I've written about is the fact that he had 12 sites that he dealt with. I mean, not hospitals, they were school buildings. You've seen the pictures, I'm sure. Residential homes, tents. They had the admissions section was in a tent. And he told the ICRC, the Red Cross, International Red Cross, that this is the new site for the hospital, and they would paint red crosses on the top and they would send the GPS positions. And of those 7 that he declared to the ICRC, who passed the information on to the army.
And the ICRC being the
International Committee of the Red Cross.
Red Cross,
and, you know, basically in wars, what you do is you declare a humanitarian site or a hospital and you give the GPS positions, and then the other side doesn't hit the hospital. Irrelevant of whether it's got soldiers in or anything like that, it's just you don't hit hospitals. It's the laws of war. And he found with those 7 sites that he declared, within hours or days, they were hit. And he learnt. And he just said the 5 of them he didn't give the positions of, and they were never hit. So he concluded that they were deliberately hitting hospitals. And that's what the UN panel report says. And that's what Human Rights Watch and ICRC have documented, over 30 cases of attacks on hospitals. And when I started to realise that when I was researching, you know, I'd assumed that they were accidental, these attacks on hospitals. They were sort of carelessness, if you like. Mm-hmm. But it became apparent that you just can't accidentally hit 30 hospitals like that, or hit hospitals 30 times. It's just not possible. So, you know, for me, it was bizarre, because the last time I saw him, I had this argument. I asked him to tell me in sort of graphic detail how it was on the day he left the war zone, and he was the last one to leave. The other doctors left first. And it was obviously extremely painful for him to talk about that time. And he really told me about how he left 150 patients under a tree. And for him, that was, you know, the failure that he can't get over, the personal sort of failure.
So despite the fact that he stayed and he saved so many lives, he focuses on the 150.
Yeah, he can't get past that. And you can understand why. I mean, it's not what a doctor does, I suppose, but it was either he would die with them or he would have a chance of life. And, you know, he had to leave. And those were people who couldn't walk out. You know, they were left in rags and, you know, injured with no medicine, with flies everywhere and rotting corpses around. It was horrific. And, you know, we had this argument where I said to him kind of, but, you know, for me, you did more than anybody. I can't imagine a doctor doing as much as you did. And, you know, how can you blame yourself? How can you feel guilty? You went way beyond the call of duty. You know, you weren't paid, you were threatened, you were told to leave, you sent your family off, you had no contact with them, you could have died any minute, you risked your own life, you'd never thought about yourself to save other people. I mean, how many doctors would do that? Let's be honest. And he said, no, I agree with you that I did my duty, but not what happens if I meet this woman? And I'm like, which woman? And he says, well, on the way out, after leaving the 150 patients under a tree, my assistant, and the assistant disappeared at the end of the war too, so that's another tragedy for him. My assistant and I found this woman. She was tending to her husband, who was really badly injured, I think, you know, leg kind of hit by something and couldn't move, and she begged us to carry him out. And he said, I talked to my assistant and I asked him, could we, you know, can we do it somehow? And the guy said, no, there's no way we can carry the man out. And they begged the woman to leave him because she was going to die if she stayed there. There were so many bullets flying around, and she, you know, very loyally stayed with her husband. And that was a time when a lot of families abandoned the injured. I mean, it's shameful and horrible, but the instinct kicks in to survive, and it was really a horrible, horrible choice. And he said to me, you know, what happens if I ever meet that woman again? How can I ever look her in the eye and say that, you know, I did my duty because I abandoned her? So you know, he's such a decent man. Oh, everybody has survivor's guilt. There's no doubt about that. But for him, that woman haunts him, and the 150 patients. He can't focus on the huge amount that he achieved.
Interesting. Well, we have a lot more to talk about, so you're going to stay with us, Frances. We're going to take a break now. Stay with us. You're watching an interview with Frances Harrison, author of Still Counting the Dead, on TVI. Welcome back. We've been speaking to Frances Harrison, author of Still Counting the Dead. So you've just spoken to us about this doctor, and you know, one of the frustrations that people in the diaspora have is actually with the UN, because they feel that everything that's come out of the UN has either been sort of a lack of real action or these watered down resolutions. And then the Petrie report comes out from the UN, and this is a report that was a review of the actions of the UN in 2009 in Sri Lanka, and it is critical. So it's critical of the UN's actions or inaction, whichever way you look at it. What are your thoughts on this report?
I think I share their frustration. I read the report the first time and I was quite excited by it. You know, I thought, wow, this is explosive stuff, and you know, it's quite vindicating. It's the same sort of things I wrote about in my chapter on the UN, and I thought, wow, this is good. It's not a whitewash. It's a really competent and honest kind of internal inquiry. And then after a day or two, I read it again, and you know, it's a fairly bureaucratically written, you know, kind of UN report, lots of acronyms and so on, and it's not sort of dramatic reading. I read it again and I felt intensely angry, actually. I felt really upset by it, and you know, I found it really difficult to read because it's really hard to accept that that people, in a sense, suppressed information about casualties and
people in the UN.
People in the UN, senior officials, although clearly at the bottom end, you know, there were kind of lower ranking UN officials who were very brave, and the Tamil staff who stayed in the war zone or had to stay in the war zone, they continued to work. It says they worked to a point of exhaustion. And you know, those who sort of blew the whistle, resigned, stood up for what they thought was right, that was a very difficult thing. They trashed their careers in a sense. So you know, you see a few people who do the right thing, but on the whole, the senior guys, you know, it's very disturbing the role they played. So yeah, I felt very upset about it.
And that seems to be sort of the feeling that you know, we hear from sort of calls or discussions. We just did a show on that report, and it was the feedback that we got from people that had watched the show as well. So given that, you know, what kind of sort of dealings do you think the Tamil diaspora? I'm just curious about your opinion. I know you are a teller of a story, you're a chronicler, but as an outside observer, I mean, we're definitely interested in hearing your opinion. What do you think the Canadian Tamil diaspora, or just the international Tamil diaspora, ought to be doing? Be it the UN or just when it comes to 2009?
Well, I mean, in a very basic sense, I think the diaspora has to look back at the last, you know, 20, 30 years of, well, even before that, peaceful democratic struggle for Tamil rights, and then armed struggle, violence and so on, and look at why it ended in catastrophe in 2009. I mean, there has to be a review and a rethink of what has gone so terribly wrong. It's not enough just to blame the outside world, although I totally understand why that's the case and why people want to do that, especially with what we've just now know and have corroborated about the UN. But you know, you're living in a world where you have to understand, you know, the international climate and what is and isn't possible, and to say that the world should be different and treat you differently is not really going to get very far. So I think a rethink, a kind of re-strategization, of, you know, thinking what you actually want to achieve now, and abandoning violence and finding a way of engaging and actually telling people what happened is also still really important. I think the vast majority of non-Tamils or non-Sri Lankans don't really know what happened in 2009. So different kinds of ways of communicating with people in a way that they're going to listen. I mean, you are very much tainted by the LTTE label and the terrorism label, and it makes it very difficult for people to engage with actually what happened in 2009, unfortunately. But you have to find a way of expressing this to people. I mean, I'm not really telling you the answer. I'm telling you the problem, I think.
The problem. Well, it's interesting because, you know, there was a part in your book where you relate the story of someone you spoke to, one of the folks in the war zone that you interviewed once she had escaped. And she tells the story about, and she hadn't cried at all throughout her dealings with you. And then she tells a story about how there was some sad story about a cat or a kitten, and it had been submitted, you know, that video had gone viral, people all over the world had shared it, and she started crying when she couldn't understand why the similar attention hadn't been paid to what had happened in Sri Lanka in 2009. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that people didn't pay attention or still don't?
I mean, she had an absolutely good point. You know, people were so worked up about a cat being mistreated, and thousands of people were dying and nobody cared. Yeah, it's extraordinary. I mean, I think it's, you know, at all sorts of levels. It was to do with the post-9/11 environment in which we lived, and you know, this was branded as a war on terror, and the LTTE were prescribed all over the world, and so that skewed the reporting of what happened and the mindset and outlook of governments all over the world. And you see that very clearly in the Petrie report, that UN diplomats told member states what they wanted to hear, which was that the terrorists were the bad ones and they were doing the killing. And then when it turned out that actually the majority of killing was by the government, they found it very difficult to square that with what their expectations were. And I think the UN obviously set the tone for the wider reporting of this war, and we're still seeing the ripples of that effect, you know, in the way that some of the questions I get asked when I go for media interviews and so on by Canadians or other people who are not, you know, Sri Lankan. And so that's one aspect of it. You know, how did so many people get killed, and we still don't know how many, and nobody know about it? I mean, partly, you know, Sri Lanka isn't Gaza or Syria. It doesn't have that ripple effect on the whole, you know, region. It's only really India that keeps an eye on what goes on, and maybe China now, but, you know, it doesn't have a huge impact. And then I think it's that it's an island. It's a quirk of geography that, you know, people couldn't get in and access those war zones in the way that they did in Syria. You know,
that's right, because you can cross borders. That's right.
And the refugees didn't pour out to another country and tell horrible stories of what had happened to them.
Which is what is happening in Syria.
Which is exactly what's happening in Syria. Yeah. So you didn't have that. And, you know, it's a very complicated war, and there's not that many kind of obvious heroes or good guys, and the world finds it very difficult to understand, you know, who's good and who's bad, and it's not simple. And I think they've sort of switched off on the mentally on the complexity of the story too, which, you know, unless you get that right. And it is really, really complicated.
It is very complicated.
And you have to struggle with that. And even if you, like me, you've lived there for a long time, it's still very difficult to know who to believe and what you really think about something. So those factors somewhat influence it. But yeah, it's just not really got attention in a way that it should. Because if you look at the scale of death, I mean, the UN panel report said 40,000. This last Petrie report says possibly 70,000 dead in 5-6 months. And, you know, the bishops talked about a larger number, and it may well be. I mean, you know, if you look at the population data, it is really worrying, the questions it raises in terms of missing people. And where in the world in the last few decades have you had that many civilians killed, you know, in this kind of, you know, violence by an army or a government, rather than sort of, you know, small incidents like in Iraq? I think it's one of the worst atrocities in terms of the space of time that it took place, you know, 5-6 months, or really only 4 months perhaps at the end. And the tiny, weeny geography, you know, that place is so small. And you're sending heavy artillery into this tiny bit of land. I mean, and people sheltering, not even in buildings, in tents and ditches. Of course, the scale of loss of life is huge. And so this is something that's, you know, really unfathomable in its horror. And it's amazing that it hasn't got more publicity. And I think, you know, the people I meet who have met survivors and talked to them and interviewed them, who are very, very few, because not many survivors want to do that, but the people I do meet who've done that, there's a kind of bond in the sense that we see it the same. You know, it's just a life-changing experience to sit there and talk to one of these people who's been through this. You just cannot see this war in the same way again.
Interesting. I actually had a similar experience when I read your book, because I was meeting these survivors through your words, and I think that's why it's important. I think the survivor stories are very important. Which brings me to my next question, actually. And I know, again, that we've discussed that you are a chronicler. And you've always said you're not a policymaker by any means. But what do you think the international community ought to be doing for Sri Lanka or in Sri Lanka going forward? I think that there's no way this country can move on from this war unless there is some sort of truth-telling about what happened in 2009. And of course, there's, you know, waves. All the people in 2009 have been through lots of displacement and killing and misery before, and the Sinhalese and the Muslims, I'm not denying, you know, the things that they went through as well. This is a very particular slice of history I've told. But I don't think you can move forward after 40,000 odd deaths or whatever it is, and just sort of say to people, put that behind you and, you know, redevelop the country and worry about the future. You just can't expect people who are so traumatized
to do that. And you can't expect the country just to sort of live through denial like that. So I think there has to be an acknowledgement of what happened. I mean, as the nun in my book put it, you know, there's forgiveness. Everyone wants forgiveness and reconciliation, but how can you have that without acknowledging what you're forgiving or what happened in the first place? I think that this process of documenting and the testimony of the survivors and establishing what really happened and who is responsible has to happen in some way, and I don't see it happening in Sri Lanka, as you can see in the last 3.5 years, and I can't see how it's ever going to happen in this environment. So I think it has to be an external process that does that. So I would say that, you know, the call from every human rights group that's out there, and the UN panel report for an independent international investigation into war crimes is important. And obviously war crimes means both sides.
And that cry seems to be getting louder. I mean, recently I've seen, I think, an article in The Economist, you know, which I would say can be conservative, right? And I've seen you write, I think you wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail too about this, but I'm seeing that echoed a few more times.
Well, it's a cry in the wilderness, maybe.
Okay.
I mean, you know, look at the actual kind of process in Geneva at the Human Rights Council. It's not about war crimes. In the UPR session, the Human Rights session recently, nobody really mentioned war crimes. You know, the word doesn't get used, although, I mean, people were more critical of the government of Sri Lanka, but the resolution in March was about implementing the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, whose mandate was
which is the Sri Lankan government's own
accountability solution, whose mandate was not to look at war crimes. It was to look at what went wrong with the peace process, and it suggested some quite sensible things about human rights to improve the situation for all Sri Lankans, which is, you know, everybody supported those bits, but where are they?
Do you think it still makes sense to keep engaging with the UNHRC?
Yes, I think, you know, certainly human rights activists who have, you know, whilst they have high standards of what they expect from countries, also, you know, have a realistic sense of what's possible in the environment that we live in. They felt that was very important, that the resolution in March kind of put on record expectations from the government in Sri Lanka, set a process in motion for the first time. So although it would be very disappointing for many people in terms of its remit and with the language being quite sort of mild, they still felt that it was a very significant step. So I think it needs supporting. And the important thing is that this coming March, when there's, you know, they report back and when the council has to decide what to do, that it shouldn't just be left to drop, it should continue in some way. Otherwise, really, I think the quest for justice for the survivors will be set back years and years, if not decades.
Interesting. Well, your book is a fantastic document that helps people understand a little bit more. Where can people get this? I know I read it as an ebook that I got off of Kobo, which is something that's well known in Canada. Where else can people get this right now?
Well, in Canada, it's published by House of Anansi, and it's on Amazon.com, you know, and on ebook. And it's also published in the UK primarily, because obviously that's where I live. And it's published in India on Penguin India as an English edition, and there soon will be the Tamil edition launched in Chennai and a Sinhala translation. So I hope that people in Sri Lanka will read it in Sinhala.
Oh, that's great. So it will be available in both Sinhala and Tamil. I'm thinking by the new year then.
The Tamil edition will be launched, I think, around the 15th of December in Chennai, and I'm going for that. And to Delhi and Chennai. And I hope the Sinhala edition around the same time. The guy who's translating it's got a bit slow, but yeah, I hope so. And the Sinhala edition will more or less give away free to anybody, you know, who can get it on the internet, and hope that at a certain level, Sinhalese will read these stories and connect as human beings with the other side, as it were.
And that's what the hope is. Thank you so much, Frances, for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you here. I wanted to end by reading this sort of a brief piece from her book, and she's actually mentioned it in what she just said about the story. And when I was reading the book, I mean, all of the stories were powerful. This morning I couldn't get the story of this doctor out of my head, and Frances herself has said that this doctor was a hero to her as well. So here it is, and this is right out of the book. Pieces of shrapnel narrowly missed him as he operated in makeshift field hospitals. He's convinced they were deliberately attacked, even though he repeatedly gave the Sri Lankan government details of their position so they'd be spared. He calculates that his team of doctors and nurses and medics saved at least 20,000 people, but he's tormented by 150 patients he abandoned under a tree on the very last day of the war. So there you have it. Frances's book, Still Counting the Dead, is available in paperback and also as an ebook. Thank you for joining us. You've been watching Frances Harrison on a special interview on TVI. That's our show for today. Thank you all for joining us. You've been watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja.
தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் டிவி.